Annie grew up in Paso Robles, so she's a native resident of San Luis Obispo County, and she did her undergrad at Cal Poly SLO. Yay! So she's an alumnus there, and she studied environmental management. And then I suspect, like many people in that program, she took a general botany class and she drank the punch, so to speak. And she decided to go on and pursue her academic career and get a master's degree. And when she went on in her career, she joined Dr. Jen Yost, who I'm sure a lot of you know, and she's going to be graduating. I'm not exactly sure when, but she was awarded a scholarship through our chapter. So she's currently a student there, and she's working on vegetation dynamics on Santa Cruz Island. And she does have this incredible love for ecology and plants. And I think some of that started when she went on her first trip out to the islands. She likes to do athletics. She participates in triathlons when she's not studying botany. And the other thing that she wanted me to tell you is that her favorite species is the Santa Cruz Island ironwood, Lithothamnus floribundus, subspecies aspleniifolius. So let's give a warm welcome to Annie, and let's see what she has to say and what she did with our chapter funding. Yay! Welcome, Annie.
Thanks, guys. Let me just share the screen here. Are you guys seeing this? Can you guys see what I'm sharing? Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah, yes.
A lot of nods. Thank you for the introduction. And first of all, thank you so much for the scholarship. It really meant a lot to me and has really helped me complete my project. Well, you know, it's never really completed, but you know, get through the sampling season. So first of all, welcome to my project. I'm studying the post-eradication dynamics of Santa Cruz Island vegetation. I'm working with Dr. Jen Yost, my advisor at Cal Poly, and Dr. Rob Klinger, who you'll hear a little bit more about in just a second, of USGS. So again, hi, I'm Annie. And I started working on Santa Cruz Island when I was about 14 years old with this awesome program called the Field Studies Collaborative at Paso Robles High School. Mark DiMaggio, who created and still runs this program, is actually in the Zoom. So if you guys have any questions about the program, he's right there. It was a really awesome program. And the picture on the right is actually of me at age 14 with my twin brother on Santa Cruz Island, sampling fennel on a transect. So it's a really awesome program, got me really stoked about ecology and really stoked about Santa Cruz Island. And so flash forward a few years later, I was ending college and I knew I wanted to get a master's degree and I knew I wanted to work in ecology. So I got a hold of somebody who had worked on Santa Cruz Island for a really long time and actually established long-term monitoring plots on Santa Cruz Island. And he said, his name is Dr. Rob Klinger. And he said, let's just make this your grad project. You can resample these old plots and we can look at how vegetation has changed on Santa Cruz Island. And so that's us on the island during sampling season. He's probably telling me something really important. And then Dr. Jen Yost said, yeah, this is a great idea. Let's get a master's degree with this project. And so next I'm going to go over a little overview about Santa Cruz Island and history. Most of you probably already know a lot of the history of Santa Cruz Island since you're the CNPS Channel Islands chapter, but some of you might not, so I'll go over it regardless. So Santa Cruz Island is part of the Northern Channel Island chain up in this right off the coast of Ventura. It's the largest of the Channel Islands and my personal favorite. And Santa Cruz Island is very topographically and geologically diverse. And so this leads to a lot of plant diversity on the island. And there are 8 distinct plant communities with about 650 plant species covering the island. And to put this in perspective, California has about 6,500 species. And so per square mile, there are about 225 times more species on Santa Cruz Island per square mile than in California. So it's like a biodiversity hotspot within a biodiversity hotspot, which is totally awesome. And there are about 170 non-native species, 37 endemic Channel Island species, and 8 Santa Cruz Island endemic species. And this makes Santa Cruz Island a really unique place to study, because when you're on Santa Cruz Island, you're looking out at vegetation that you're not going to see anywhere else, because there are these endemic species that exist nowhere else in the world, which is so awesome. And those are a few pictures of some of my favorite endemic species. However, about 150 years ago, non-native herbivores were introduced to the island, and that includes cattle, sheep, and pigs, and they had numerous detrimental effects on the native vegetation. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what this grazing looked like. So grazing was typically corridored off into different pastures. And so this is what it looked like for cattle grazing. So these darker blue areas on the map are where heavy cattle grazing was. And then the lighter blue areas are where lighter cattle grazing was. And so population estimates of cattle were around 10,000 to 30,000, and they tended to prefer sloping valleys. They didn't really venture up into steeper slopes or rougher terrain. And we assume that their grazing preference on the island was more herbaceous species. And the cattle were removed in 1987 after the Nature Conservancy bought the island from the original ranchers. And so next we can look at sheep, and sheep were grazed opposite of the cattle. They are capable of handling rougher terrain, steeper slopes, rockier areas. And so these darker green areas are showing us where they're grazing. And these are typically steeper areas on the island. And sheep are much more capable of grazing through shrubs. They don't seem to mind too much. And the sheep were removed in 1989. And so our next animal are pigs. And so pigs are a little bit different than sheep and cattle when it comes to removal. So when pigs run feral, they're not gentle or docile. They're pretty aggressive. And Rob Klinger, mentioned earlier, he started a project I'm working on, was actually hired on the island to help eradicate these pigs. And he would go out every day with a group of dogs and a gun and a knife, and that's how they did it. They would hunt them down. That started in 1990s, but the pigs weren't completely removed until 2007 when they brought in an Australian company who shot the pigs from the air in a helicopter. So a bunch of these non-native herbivores running all around Santa Cruz Island, we can expect a lot of devastation to happen to native vegetation. And so this is what Santa Cruz Island looked like in the 1990s, immediately after removal of these animals. And so what we see is a lot of bare ground, a lot of cover of invasive species, and very little shrub cover. And so what we can expect in later years is perhaps recovery of shrubs and less bare ground, but we also do expect invasive species to still be present. And so this is what it looks like in 2010s. We see a lot of shrub recovery, there's less bare ground, but there's still invasive species present. And so this is where my project, my research comes in. My research is attempting to examine the transition of vegetation from a heavily grazed ecosystem to an ecosystem without any grazers. And so there were 100 plots established on the island in 1991. and they span the entirety of the island. And they also span the 5 most common vegetation types on the island, which include 37 grassland plots, 12 fennel plots, 8 coastal scrub plots, 32 chaparral plots, and 11 woodland plots. So it really covers the span of the most common vegetation types on the island so that we could capture the effects of these grazers on all the different types of vegetation. And we also have a variety of different grazing regimes represented by these plots. And so we can really tell where these animals were, what sort of damage happened to the different vegetation types. So we can really see what has happened on Santa Cruz Island over the past 30 years to the native vegetation and non-native. And so the data set spans 1991 through 1995 and 1998. And then I was born in 1999, so I don't feel that bad about not being invited to the initial sampling anymore. And then I decided that it was a great idea to resample in 2022 to see what's happened since this initial 1990s sampling. And so when we're out at a plot on Santa Cruz Island, this is kind of what it looks like. This T-post up here at the front represents a plot. That's what we're looking for when we're searching for one of these dots on the map. And then once we find a plot, we pull out a 30-meter transect line in hopes of finding this end of transect marker. And that marker means that we are in the same exact spot that they were at in the 1990s. So we're measuring in the same exact direction, same exact location as the 1990s sampling. So we can get a direct comparison. And so we measure all of the plants within a 2 by 30 meter plot in order to get an estimate of plant coverage, species diversity, all sorts of different metrics. And we do this with 4 different protocols. Point intercept, so every 30 centimeters, we say what plant is there. Woody count, we count every single woody individual within the plot. Woody line intercept, so we measure the length of each woody species along the transect, and then we take a list of every single species present. And so now I'm going to show you a little bit about what the sampling season looked like, because it was a really awesome event, and that's what this funding went towards. So I'm going to show you some highlights, and it was really awesome. So this is what our gear setup looked like on the left. We took out walkie-talkies every day so that we could communicate with each other. Super fun. And every night we would come back from the field and we would check out voucher specimens. So we took voucher specimens for every plant that we saw in a plot, and then we would check each other at the end of the night. We also tried to do plant ID for any plants that we couldn't ID in the field at the end of the night. And if we couldn't ID them at the end of the night, we pressed them and took them back to the herbarium and spent a whole lot more time trying to ID them. So one of the highlights for me was definitely driving around the island. So the Nature Conservancy is part of sponsoring my project, and we get to take these awesome Nature Conservancy vehicles all around the island on these awesome dirt roads to get to our plots, which makes it a lot easier than hiking all around the island. And it was a really wonderful experience. And one of my biggest, well, everything's a highlight when you're on the island, but one of the biggest was seeing the plants in the spring. Every time I've been to the island beforehand, it was fall or summer, and so everything was pretty dry. But this is what it looks like in the spring at Fraser Point. So we got really lucky and we got to see a really incredible super bloom out at Fraser Point, which was such an awesome experience. Look at those colors. I was absolutely stunned because in summer and in fall, it's gray and crunchy and beautiful, but not colorful like this. And then we also got to see a species that I've been wanting to see for a long time, Calochortus catalinae, which is the endemic Calochortus to the Channel Islands. And it was absolutely everywhere, you guys. Every corner we turned, Calochortus catalinae was there, and we couldn't help but stop and scream and admire this plant. Here are some other highlight plants that we saw on the island. Again, I was just so stoked that everything was in flower. It was such an awesome experience. And one of my other favorite moments of the trip, of course, was, as I mentioned before, my favorite tree is the Santa Cruz Island ironwood. So we spent some time laying in an ironwood grove, and everybody definitely enjoyed that. And then at the end of a really hard day, we would have some really awesome beach days. And beach days on Santa Cruz Island are pretty unparalleled. And so now that's enough highlights from the sampling trip. I'm going to get into what resulted from this sampling trip, aside from a ton of fun. So here are some numbers from sampling. So we collected voucher specimens for every single plot. And so I expect that we have over 500 voucher specimens from Santa Cruz Island, which is awesome. These plants are all pressed and will be mounted and put into an herbarium where people can use them for years to come. We have over 1,800 data points of different plants within these plots. That's a significant amount of data, and that is just for 2022. We also have a woody species count of 876 adult woody species, 290 saplings, and 245 seedlings within these plots. That's awesome. And overall, the sampling years, we so far have 360 plant species noted within these plots. And so what can we do with all of this data? Well, we can look at a lot of different things. This data is pretty awesome, very comprehensive, and it allows us to look at composition and structure and woody species counts, and we can divide that by adult or sapling or seedling so we can understand when establishment happens. We can also look at woody species cover over time and diversity and species richnesses within these plots and on the island. So it's a really awesome comprehensive data set. And so the main questions that we want to start to answer with this data set is, how do our island plant communities respond after removal of grazers 30 years later? And so there are two things that we really think of is, will the native species recover or will non-native species dominate? What we think we'll see is a novel assemblage of species coming together. So both non-native and native species will exist in the same space. And as for our specific hypotheses, we expect that there will be an increase in native shrubs. And we also expect that we'll see an initial increase in invasive species, because if you remove grazers and there's no longer anything to graze these invasive species, and so they're going to skyrocket for a little bit. But we also expect there to be a decrease over time as native species recover. And so I'm going to first start showing you a few patterns on the island by using some geospatial data that can tell us at a larger level, larger patterns that are going on the island. And this data is called the Rangeland Analysis Platform. And this is what it looks like. So this is the island in 1991, and it's colored blue. The darker areas represent areas with higher shrub cover. The lighter areas represent areas with lower shrub cover. So we see there's not a whole lot of shrub cover going on here. This is what it looks like in 2022. So we see that there's much more blue, darker blue in this picture. And if we pull up a graph of this using that data, this is what shrub cover looks like over time, over the entirety of the island using this spatial data. And this pattern of increase is significant. So we go from about 10% shrub cover over the entirety of the island to about 30% shrub cover over the course of these years. But what about our annual non-native grasses? And so this image is showing the cover of annual non-native grasses. So where there's darker red, more annual grasses, lighter red, less annual grasses. And this is 1991. And so remember I said we expected an initial increase without grazers? Well, this is what it looks like in 1998. So looking at this picture, we would think there was an initial increase. And then I suggested that we expect a decrease over time with an increase in native species. And so this is what it looks like in 2022, which is stark, a very stark difference. Now, there are a few reasons for this, which we'll get into in a second. And so this is what annual grass cover looks like over time on the island. So there's not too much of a clear pattern, except from 1990 to 2000, where we do see an increase immediately after removal of the animals. And then it kind of goes back and forth for a few years. And so if we think about it, annual grasses really respond to rainfall. And so if we add rainfall into the equation, it starts to make a little more sense. And so we think rainfall is really affecting the cover of annual grasses on the island. And so from this data, the geospatial data, we can see larger patterns, and we understand that the shrubs are significantly increasing over time due to removal of the animals, but that there's kind of a different pattern with our non-native species. And so now we're going to dive into looking at the data that I collected on the island over spring. And we're going to look at a few different species trends, but we're specifically going to break it up into the different community types to try and understand what happened in each of them after the grazes were removed. So we're going to start off with grasslands. So this is what a typical grassland on Santa Cruz Island looks like. And this map up here in the right corner is showing you where they're located for our sampling scheme. And in the 1990s, the dominant species in these plots were typically Avena, Bromus deandrus, and Festuca perennis, which are all invasive annual grasses. And so what we hypothesized for these areas is that with removal of the grazing animals, we'll expect a recovery of native shrubs in the grasslands. And so I'm going to start by showing you what happened by showing you a specific example of plot number 1. So this is plot number 1 in 2022. I came here 2 years ago with Rob Klinger, and we stood there for a little bit, and then he turned to me and he said, "Annie, I got to tell you, this plot used to be completely covered by annual grasses, and there was not a shrub in sight." And I said, "Rob, there's absolutely no way." So I pulled up the data, and this is what it looks like. So in the 1990s, non-native grasses did dominate this plot. But now in 2022, it's dominated by the island buckwheat, an endemic shrub species that is now recovering in this area without grazing. And so we also see this pattern over all of our grassland plots. We not only see our endemic buckwheat increasing, we also see a California native, Artemisia californica, the California sagebrush, is also significantly increasing in these grassland communities. What we also see in these areas is a significant decrease in invasive grasses, which used to completely dominate these grassland areas. But now there's more of a mix of these native shrubs. And so we see this pattern within our grassland communities. And we have a subset of grassland plots that we like to call fennel plots. And so fennel is this invasive species that was a species of big concern on the island. And so fennel looks a little bit like this in the spring. It's those gray sticks that you see on this landscape. And in the spring, in the summer, fennel looks a little more like this. So it's leafed out, it's blooming. And so we actually return in summer to measure fennel in summer rather than in spring when it looks like this. And so the fennel plots are organized as in the right-hand corner, and all of these plots are within heavily grazed cattle areas. And intuitively, the dominant species in these plots was fennel, Funiculum vulgare, and also Bromus deandrus, another invasive annual grass. And so we have the same prediction as we did with grasslands, that we would see an increase in native shrubs in these areas in the fennel-dominated plots. And so I'm going to start off again with a very specific example of a plot. So this plot, similar to the last one, in the 1990s was completely dominated by fennel. And we can see that it's still here if you look for those gray sticks in the ground. But we also now see Artemisia californica, the California sagebrush, in these areas, which is this gray-green shrub that also smells really awesome. And so that is what this looks like. So we see this huge increase in the California sagebrush since the 1990s. We also see a decrease in fennel. And so that pattern's consistent across all 12 of our fennel plots. There is a hugely significant increase in the California sagebrush within these plots. We also see a decrease in fennel. But remember when I discussed earlier that I think that these species are responding to rainfall? If we pull up a box plot of fennel with a line, a blue line that represents, here, can you guys see my mouse? Can I get a thumbs up? Maybe not. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so this blue line here represents rainfall. And these box plots here are representing cover of fennel over time. And so we see fennel is sort of following this rainfall pattern. And it does significantly correlate with rainfall rather than years post removal of the grazers. But we don't see the same pattern with the California sagebrush. If we pull up a box plot of the California sagebrush, it's not really responding to rainfall at all. In fact, we don't really see much of Artemisia californica pop up until our 2022 sampling, which is awesome. It means that there's been significant change in this species, in these plots, over the past 20 years since sampling. And so the next vegetation type that we're going to talk about is coastal scrub. So in the previous two, in grasslands and fennel, we discussed that there was an increase in Artemisia californica and in Eriogonum arborescens in the grasslands. These are species that we consider coastal scrub species. And so coastal scrub in the 1990s was dominated by Artemisia californica and Bromus deandris. We really didn't see the endemic buckwheat. But we hypothesized that while we don't expect coastal scrub to shift to a different community type, we do expect to see an increase in certain species. And we see an increase in our native endemic buckwheat. We also see an increase in this endemic sunflower that wasn't really even noted in the plots in the 1990s. And we also see an increase, a significant increase, in these two California native species as well, the blue dix and Stipa pulchra, which is totally awesome. So we're seeing recovery of these native species in plots on Santa Cruz Island. And so now we're going to kind of look at this on the map scale. So these are the plots in the 1990s where orange is grassland, green is fennel, and blue is coastal scrub. In the 1990s, the plots are pretty well dominated by grassland and fennel, and there are very few coastal scrub plots. But if we consider that a higher amount of shrubs, especially of the California sagebrush and the island endemic buckwheat, mean that this is now a coastal scrub community, this is now what the island communities look like, considering these three different vegetation types. We see there's a huge increase in areas that we might consider a coastal scrub community, which is awesome. There's a total transition of communities happening right here after removal of these animals, which is totally awesome. And so these three communities play really well with each other. But the next two communities that we're going to talk about are chaparral and woodland, and these are structured much differently than grassland, fennel, and coastal scrub. And so our chaparral community looks a little bit like this. if I were to give it a sample rating, I would say extreme. You might get poked in the eye a little bit, but still fun and sometimes nice and shady for you. The plots are stratified in this map over here. And these plots are dominated by manzanitas, by the bishop pine, and by Crocus pacifica, which is an island scrub oak. And so what we predict in these areas, again, is not a shift in community type, but instead we expect that lower growing understory shrubs will increase in these areas. And we do see this occurring within our data. These species are all island endemic species, whether at the subspecies level or variation level. And these are all significantly increasing in the understory of our chaparral community, which is awesome. And so this suggests that grazers, while on their time on the island, grazed through the understory of chaparral, and now these endemic species are returning after 30 years of recovery to these areas. So our next vegetation type is woodland. So woodland, though very similar to chaparral, is totally dominated by Crocus pacifica and has a much higher canopy than chaparral will. And so it looks a little bit like this. That's my undergrad, Mari. She did some awesome work on fennel over summer. And this is where these plots are located. And again, our hypothesis would be that with grazers removed, we expect understory species to increase. And so we do see this. We actually see all of the same species in the former slide increase within this community as well. But we see additional species, including the island ceanothus, chamise, and we also see these 2 coastal scrub species starting to populate the understory of these woodlands, which is really interesting and awesome just to see the dynamics of these vegetation without grazers. And so what I'm going to show you guys next is something new that I'm working on. So maybe hang in there a little bit, but I'm pretty excited about it. And I think that it's a really good way to show how the communities are actually shifting. And I think you guys might think so too. So we're going to start off with species abundance data. So that means we have a plot in a specific year, and each plant has its own abundance. And so what we can do to look at that, to visualize shifts, is place them on a graph based on how similar they are in species within that plot. And so if you're looking at these numbers, these represent plots on that graph. And so these plots are less similar in species composition. And these plots closer together are more similar in species composition. So what we can do is then say, okay, that's 1995 and plot 1 and 2 in 1995. And this is 1996 and plot 1 and 2 in 1996. And they're different from each other in this mock-up case. And so this circle right here represents the center of that specific year. And so we can say, did a shift occur? And so if we're looking at, did a transition occur with this sort of graph, we can see 3 sorts of options happen. So one that could happen is there's no significant transition between the years. They completely overlap. And so we didn't see anything happen. Another thing that we can see is maybe one year has a much bigger area than the other. And this doesn't suggest a transition, but it suggests that there's more species abundance in that year. And if a transition were to occur, we would see something like this. So there's a complete shift in the community from one year to another. What we can also do with this is figure out what is causing a significant shift. And so we can pull up these arrows, and it might say something like, in the later years, there are more native shrubs. And in the earlier years, there's more non-native species. And so this is a really powerful tool to use. And I'm going to show you what that looks like for the grassland community on Santa Cruz Island. So this is what it looks like and with just the 1990s data. So 2022 is not in here. So each of these larger polygons represents a year of species composition. Each of these smaller symbols represents a specific plot. And the lighter colored polygon is an earlier year. So this back one right here is 1991. And then this front one up here is going to be our later year. So in this case, 1998. And each of these circles in the center represents the center of a year of data. And so what we see is the community is shifting in this direction that the arrow is pointing. And so we might expect that 2022 will be further in this direction. And that's exactly what we see. So 2022 grassland plots are way different than the 1990s, which is totally awesome. So we see there's a significant difference between the 2022 species composition and the rest of our earlier sampling years. And so in order to see what's driving this, we add in our arrows, and we see that in the earlier years over here, these are all invasive annual grass species, and higher covers of these are defining the 1990s data. While in the 2022 data, we see this is Artemisia californica, our California sagebrush, Stipa pulchra, our state bunch grass, Eriogonum arborescens, our island endemic buckwheat. And so we see that an increase in these species is driving these plots to be different from the 1990s, which is so awesome. And so let's actually look at patterns in those species so we can confirm that they actually are different from the 1990s. All right, so let's just remove that. And if we look at Artemisia californica, we see that there's barely any Artemisia californica in grassland communities until about 2022. And so this is significantly pulling our grassland data, our 2022, to be different from the rest of the years. We see the same pattern in our island endemic buckwheat. We don't really see it significantly pop up until our 2022 sampling year. Stipa pulchra also significantly increasing over the course of the sampling years and defining grasslands in our 2022 sampling year. But what about our invasive grasses? So we see kind of a different pattern in our non-native grasses. 2022 was our lowest rainfall sampling year. And so, as I mentioned earlier, when we add rainfall into the equation, it explains the variation in our non-native grasses. And so these species are defining the 1990s data from our 2022 data. And they really define the difference in these community transitions. And so to wrap it up, how do communities on this island change after a major disturbance? Well, we see there's a big increase in native shrubs and an interesting decrease in invasive species that we think is due to rainfall, but we'll test a little further. And we do see that invasive species and native species are existing in the same space. But the only way to test this would be to do a competition experiment in the lab. But just from observations in the field, they seem to be existing in the same space together. And again, we did see an increase in native shrubs and this interesting play with invasive species. And so with that, my future work on the island will be to continue to answer a bunch of different questions about what happened over the course of time. One of the things that I'm currently looking at is what environmental predictors determine these community transitions. And one of my hypotheses is that soils and grazing intensities are driving where the transitions might occur in vegetation. And this is a map of the soils. And I hope to continue working with the high school, with Mark DiMaggio, on the field studies program, because it's a really, really totally awesome program that starts a lot of kids off on the right foot when it comes to science. And in the future for this project, there will be resampling for interannual variation. And for my future, I received the NSF GRFP. So I will be applying to PhD programs in December, really soon here. And these are a few universities that I'm thinking of going to, but there's many more on the list. And with that, I would really like to thank my funding sources, especially all of you at CNPS. You guys have really supported this project, and it really means a lot to me to have your support. And I really appreciate you guys hosting me for this talk. So with that, I would like to thank you for listening to my talk and open the floor for any questions.
Okay, we'll go ahead and take questions. You can put them in the chat and I can read them, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask directly. Thanks a lot, Annie.
Thanks.
Can you hear me, Annie?
I can hear you.
Okay, so of the drivers, that like second to the last slide that you showed, you had soil type and grazing intensity.
Mhm.
And I was wondering like why rainfall wasn't there.
Oh, it is one of our predictors. I did also sneak peek. I did run a very preliminary analysis today, and considering all of those factors, rainfall was no longer a significant predictor, which was very interesting and makes me think that shrubs may be really driving these vegetation transitions rather than the invasive species. But I still have a lot of further testing to do, and those are just the main drivers that I think are in control. But there are a lot of other factors that I'm testing, like slope and aspect and temperature, yearly temperatures. There's all sorts of ecological things that are in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have any other questions from out on the floor? Ooh, Leslie has her hand up. Go ahead, Leslie.
Yeah, I wondered, you had mentioned the Bromus deandrus at one point, which, you know, it is pretty invasive. Is that still around, or is that one of the ones that has decreased as well?
It's definitely still around, but because I sampled in a drought year, all of the grasses decreased in coverage, but it's definitely still around.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'm getting one from Andrea, and it's the one that I had as well. And she wants to know, in the spring, can you run through the list of what the flowers were in that big, colorful photo you showed towards the beginning?
Oh yeah, I'll just scroll right on over to that real quick. I would love to tell you. Okay, so this right here, you guys can all see my mouse, right? Just a thumbs up. Great. Okay, so this is Calochortus catalinae. It's the island Calochortus. Calochortus are magical, and this is one of the most magical. And then this plant right here, it's not a flower, but it's still one of my favorites on the island. It's this endemic island shrub called island redberry, which is Rhamnus perifolia. This is Primula clevelandii. I believe it's subspecies insularis, which makes it another Channel Island species, but this is a shooting star. And then this is a monkey flower on the island, so that's Diplochus arntiacus. And then this plant right here is the island bush poppy, another really awesome plant. It's Dendromicon harfordii, and it smells like Jolly Ranchers. which is great. This is a plant called Mirabilis. It's a wishbone bush, really adorable, very cute flowers. It's actually not a shrub. It's a forb. And then this is Heuchera maxima, which is another island endemic, and it's got these really wonderful tiny white flowers that I wish I got a better close-up of, but it's kind of a rare plant. So when I saw it on the island, I totally freaked out and took a bunch of really bad pictures of it. And so you guys get to be witness to a bad picture of one. And this is the island ceanothus, wild lilac, wonderful plant. This is Castanea hololuca, another island plant, believe it or not. And it's this island endemic paintbrush. It's a little shrubby. It's wonderful. And this one is a flower that blooms in the summer. It's Lilium humboldtii. And these little anthers will get pollen like all over you, and it will stain everything, but it's worth it for this plant. So that's this side. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. We had another question, and it's kind of a speculative thing, but we were wondering if, this is from Matthew, if there was any sense of the shifts in the wildlife communities as the shrubs came in, you know, were you noticing any different arrays or assemblages of wildlife as that shift happened?
Well, I don't have any data on wildlife, so I can't quantitatively say anything. I also wasn't born during the previous sampling seasons, so I don't really know the answer to that question. But that's a good question to ask Dr. Rob Klinger. I do know that the fox populations changed a ton, so that's the only thing I can take note of. But
great. And continuing on here, Holly would like to know how long it took you to complete this year's sampling.
Yeah, there's a tradition with this project to make it just this really awesome like all-together sampling season. So I recruited my grad student friends, professors to come out and work with me. And so we got all 100 plots done in about 11 days. So it was really awesome. And Mark came out too, and it was just a really wonderful time where we got so many plots done. But yeah, 11 days.
Right. And so some people are still wondering, that was not the photo, but the one of, and it might be Fraser Point, I'm not sure, but the flowers in the slide previous to this one.
Okay.
Were there different species in there? That's the one that people want to know specifically.
This is the one. Yeah. So in the forefront here, this is Allobronia species. I don't remember the specific epithet. And then this purple is going to be Phacelia. And then there was a bunch of Lysenia and Goldfields out here. So there wasn't a ton of species, but they were really creating this wonderful, like, colored Fraser Point.
Nice. Thank you for that. Another comment about the Humboldt lilies, and I'm just going to comment quickly that I grew up making freckles on my face with those, and we would leave the pollen freckles for as long as we could. That's a funny little anecdote. But then we have Mike, and he wants to know, are there other factors besides removal of the ungulates that could also be contributing to the observed transitions in the vegetation communities? And if you talked about this, he apologizes if he missed it. But is there anything else aside from removal of the grazers that could be moving this direction?
Yeah, we've thought of a ton of different factors and run through them, including, like I discussed earlier, rainfall and even fire. But these factors that we can think of have all been eliminated as we think through them. Like with fire, there isn't a ton of fire on the island. Rainfall, rainfall might affect establishment of species of these shrubs, but shrubs are a longer lived species, and so we expect a bigger disturbance event to affect the trajectory of our shrub species more than rain, like interannual variation in rainfall will. So yeah, we've run through quite a few, but we've come to the conclusion that the non-native herbivores were really such a huge disturbance that they're probably the only, well, not the only reason, but the main reason that we're seeing this increase in shrubs.
Great. And Mark was also wondering about the fire regimes and if, you know, that was included in your analysis. So I think that we caught that one there. So I guess I will last call for questions if anybody has any other burning questions for Annie. I'll say going once. I kind of have a question, and it's not really a question, it's more just like a comment of sorts. With the island and the recovery that you were able to observe and document, it's like super inspiring and awesome, like you said. And I just have to be like a little bit of a devil's advocate and wonder if the system is not closed like an island, if we can, you know, look forward to that same transition, not necessarily from overgrazing, but other threats, you know, like if we do remove grazers from heavily grazed areas, like are the adjacent parcels just going to flood those areas, and will we be able to see the recovery that you've observed? You'll be interested if you had an analog, like a non-island place, and if we could see similar transitions on the mainland, for example, because it's an inspiring pattern, right? If we are seeing native vegetation communities and endemic species returning. So that would be what I would want you to focus on.
Yeah, we've definitely thought about that, of having a mainland comparison data set. It's definitely hard to find these long-term data sets, but I do really like that thought of this is an island system, it's closed. What happens when we look at a mainland comparison just 20 miles away? So that's a really interesting thought, and it might be subject to more of an influx from invasive species or other disturbances. But I'm not sure the answer to that question, but I think that's a really interesting future direction for a study.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and give Annie another big round of applause. It was wonderful to have you, and don't forget us when you go on your PhD, and you know, circle back and you can tell us what you're working on, and stay connected, you know, of course, to the Native Plant Society at the local and state level.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I really appreciate you guys having me.
And thanks to everybody for joining us. It was a great turnout tonight, and we hope you stay tuned because we have an exciting year ahead of us.